Welcome back to the panel discussion, Federal News Radio's National Cybersecurity Awareness Month special panel discussion, sponsored by BAE Systems on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. Our guests today are Kevin Stein, manager of the Security Outreach and Integration Group in the Computer Security Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Michael J. Levin, Director of Security Design and Innovation at the Office of Information Security for the Department of Health and Human Services, Dave McClure, Chief Strategist at the Veris Group and former Associate Administrator at General Services Administration's Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies, and Peter Junk, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at BAE Systems. I'm your moderator, Karen Evans. In the last segment, we were talking and we stopped with risk management, and Dave, you really laid out a good framework foundation about what risk management is. So I'd like to build on that, since that's pretty much saying, okay, now everything is based on risk, and make you guys talk a little bit more about what do you think are the now we have 7 deadly sins here of IT security or cybersecurity, whichever way you want to go, or what are the basic assumptions that people make that then kind of trip them up when they're running these services out in the departments and agencies. So I'm going to go in reverse and start with Peter this time and work my way down.
I think one of the things that we need to open up in the dialogue is that kind of there's assumptions we've all worked on that are maybe harming our ability to defend ourselves going forward. And so if you look at that as kind of defining these 7 deadly sins of kind of IT security, it's one, we taught people to establish a perimeter, as was kind of brought up by Michael kind of earlier. And if I can keep them outside, I'm safe. And what we've learned is, everything's permeable. That email comes all the way onto the inside. We also had this notion of if we inform people about the vulnerabilities in our systems, then, nobody will know about it and we'll be safer. As opposed to really what we're finding is, as you find out something that's wrong, as you are looking for these things, it's sharing of information, sharing of that knowledge as fast as you can is actually what's helping us, as opposed to kind of this cloak and dagger. I think another one is, while encryption is still very good, just because something's encrypted doesn't mean that it's necessarily safe, especially as far as our data. If an adversary gets those same keys, it's like my car keys in a valet is just as unsafe as, any other type of place. It's like, the keys defend us only if somebody doesn't have it. But we need to understand that. And then I think you have a few other things that you get down into, such as kind of even, let me make sure it's one of my employees and we get identity, but we've seen things like malware that will operate on somebody's machine after they leave at night or the rest. And so you can't just kind of draw some of these core kind of lines. And the other piece, and I kind of leave it this without maybe going through all 7, is, to highlight my data isn't of interest to somebody else. And I think that's, especially as we talk about supply chain security, we really forget is that it might be 100 small pieces that seem inconspicuous, unrelated, but if somebody else knows what the jigsaw puzzle looks like and what they need, it's accumulating those. And so I think we get a lot of people lulled into a sense of inaction because they think, I'm not that high-profile target. I'm not holding credit card data. I'm not holding some of these other things. Or, my IP is I'm just, going in and whittling down the metal piece to go to somebody else to put it into the final form of a defense platform or something else. And they're like, well, don't worry about those CAD CAM drawings. I'm only using part of it. And I think this is where that notion of, is your data valuable is in the eyes of somebody else, kind of not in yours. And so I think these are assumptions that many people have operated on that I think really, as we look at cyber, we need to kind of turn on top of its head.
So, Dave, when you talk about this, I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench in this, so you wait till the end down here, Kevin. There's a couple pieces that were brought up, which consistently come up, and it's the supply chain and the person not really realizing the value of what they're working on, and then how that goes across. And I think that that's a basic assumption. If you could talk a little bit more about that while you're addressing your assumptions or your 7 deadly sins, I think that's the crux of a lot of the issue of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I would agree. So I'll start with that. I had it listed as forgetting about data stewardship. I think if people in an organization don't truly understand what it is they're doing with data, how they're creating it, accessing it, storing it, sharing it, and then putting that ultimately into that risk management framework, security becomes a very amorphous thing. It's very theoretical as opposed to real. So I think a lot of the switches that we see occurring are more interest in understanding who owns the data, who has access to data, what's the purpose of the data, what are the boundaries and conditions that are put on that data that you need to be consciously aware of in a security approach. And to me, that's fundamental. It sounds like punt, pass, and kick, but it's very fundamental to doing security extremely well. So that's one thing. I think another thing in terms of these 7 deadly sins, and I won't do 7, I think better hit a lot of them. A lot of this, one of the deadly sins is about feeling as though you're secure based on point-in-time information. Our security approach in the government in the past was very much static-based information. You passed it, you're fine. Then you revisit it again 12 months, 18 months, 24 months later. And we all know that's a false sense of security. We have to make sure that we don't get caught in that trap. Second deadly sin, security audits and responses to security audits are adequate. And again, that's usually very much a point-in-time, compliance-focused audit rather than something that's focused on real-time operational things. Mistaking compliance for trust. I think that's a big misnomer in the federal space, is that if I'm compliant, I have a trusted relationship in my own organization with whoever I'm interacting with. And trust relationships, particularly in identity management, are really, really, really critical to get down straight. And the last one I'd mention is because of the focus on CDM, continuous diagnostics, and mitigation, we have a lot of attention now being focused on analytics and gathering intelligence, and we have to remember that you have to do something about it. So the mitigation and response and evidence that the response is effective, we've got to make sure that tail is also taken care of.
So, Michael, there were some great concepts in there, especially the differentiation between action and point in time. And I know that you've been working on some of these types of things in order to be able to move HHS into a more virtual type of environment, but also balancing the risk and the data and what your customers or what all of HHS has to do. Do you want to talk about that in relationship to how you structured that, making some of these basic assumptions of what people would or wouldn't do when you come up with a solution?
So Dave raised an excellent point concerning CDM, continuous diagnostics and mitigation. Basically how we're moving away from the 3-year FSMA cycle of authorization once and nothing changes for the next 3 years. You've got this binder to protect you. The binder keeps us safe. We're moving towards a ongoing authorization, which is what the goal of CDM is. For those not familiar with CDM, it's the DHS program of 15 different phases, 3 phases, 15 different steps within it, very similar to the SANS 20. Focused upon basically improving the security posture of the federal government across the whole, all the federal agencies. It's something close to $500 million over 3 years. Right now, they're still in phase 1, which is focused on basically managing attack surface. It's configuration management, vulnerability management, software, hardware. And this is something that's going to basically mature the federal government's security stance significantly once it's actually fully stood up. As Dave mentioned, we are no longer going to be doing a point in time. We're no longer going to be saying that, I'm secure at this moment, so therefore I'm going to be secure forever. It's actually going to reflect the actual reality that your system gets patched every week. Your system is being updated. And with that, new bugs are also being introduced, not just the patch. It recognizes the concept of network hygiene and security hygiene, basically, showing that you just because you were safe yesterday doesn't mean you're safe today. The realities of basically the modern world. That is a huge movement and a huge improvement towards actual risk management. The problem with, well, at least my problem, with the current risk management framework, 837, a lot of it is qualitative versus quantitative. So it comes back to the metrics that are currently being used. and they're all ordinal. So it's low, medium, high. So that's wonderful relative to each other, but it's basically what, it's qualitative. It's what I think it is versus, an actual like specific number that you can't argue. And that's my personal problem with a lot of the concepts in risk, the way risk is managed right now. Back to your other question about the 7 deadly sins. For cybersecurity, there's no reason to update those from the existing 7 deadly sins, though they might not all fit. Pride. There's a lot of hubris and belief that basically my network is secure, everything is secure right now. In the previous session, Petter had an excellent analogy about a house and how a house is broken into. I see networks more as a boat than a house, and what I mean by that is boats are always leaking, but you have a bilge pump, and you're constantly finding where the leaks are, and you're constantly patching those leaks. I think that's a better analogy than a house, maybe a houseboat. So you have to recognize that reality, that there are always going to be leaks because it's a complex system, and you're always going to have to find those leaks and try and patch them, and then it comes back to the cost-benefit analysis and whether the patching is worth it and how you're going to do the patching. You can't always take your, dry dock your boat every single time there's a small patch. You have to deal with it as you need to. Back to the 7 deadly sins. Pride is the belief that your houseboat is waterproof. And basically that belief that, there's nothing outside, there's nothing, everything is safe. That's not true. Anybody that tells me their network is 100% secure doesn't know their network, or they have a very small network. So, sloth. That one's fairly obvious. Belief that the previous solutions still work today. The threat landscape's constantly changing, and basically you have to always be, we can't be one step ahead. That's impossible. It's a game of cat and mouse, and basically you just have to be aware that the vulnerabilities out there are constantly evolving, and you have to be evolving with it. Greed. Vendors are always trying to sell you something new and better. That may not do what you want it to, and I don't know how to shoehorn lust and gluttony in there, let alone wrath or envy. So you got 3.
Well, we could probably work on that.
Yeah.
So Kevin, there's a couple other concepts that came up, and I think based on my background, always kind of gets my feathers ruffled, which is the compliance point, the point in time, the static, the 3-year, you do 3 years and then you're done. And you might want to talk a little bit more about that, because not that I'm going to quote the policy, but the policy does say unless there's any major changes. So it's a minimum of 3 years. So it wasn't 3 years and done. So following on some of the stuff that Michael has been talking about, wouldn't you say that the changing in the environment today makes it that you have to have constant evaluation, constant looking at it, so that the implementation of the CDM program is really implementation of risk management again in today's environment? Not that the policy is wrong, guys, but that the environment has changed so much that 3-year mark is no longer relevant.
Yeah, I think so. So we always go back to this idea, kind of maybe back to one of Michael's or some of the other panelists' previous points. Compliance does not mean security, but compliance can be a byproduct of good security. From our perspective, the policies, again, evolve over time. While the policies may specify, say, a 3-year window or not to exceed a 3-year window, for example, for authorization of systems and those types of things. Certainly doesn't prevent an organization, or wouldn't have prevented an organization from doing that much more frequently, depending upon their threat environment, their operating environment, changes to those. I think, but certainly from the NIST standard and guideline perspective, we've always viewed this, and we believe the guidelines that we've issued really focus on, really more active risk management, not to be kind of confined to that 3-year window, if you will, but more kind of, as needed as your environment's changing and those types of things. And I think policies are evolving, at the federal level to kind of capture those changes in the environments now. OMB, I guess within the last year or so, issued a memo on ongoing authorization. NIST, in response to that, developed some guidance for kind of transitioning from the static 3-year process to a more ongoing authorization model. And I think in large part that was really just leveraging the existing standards and guidelines that we had in place already and trying to highlight those. So I think and then you have solutions like CDM that are kind of, coming on board right now. And I think all those things are really helping to kind of better position the federal agencies to be able to manage risk in a more kind of adaptive and agile way. Maybe back to the original question that we all focus on, I'll kind of head nod a lot.
I was going to say, I was going to give you about the 7 deadly sins, and I can actually kind of put one in there. One might argue that you bypass gluttony, okay, which would say that there is a plethora of NIST guidelines out there, which could fall under gluttony. Okay, so you want to address that, because I think that becomes really hard. And it's not just the agencies looking at it. Private industry, countries, nationally, internationally, look at the NIST guidelines. And so how would you address those as it relates to these 7 deadly sins?
So that's an interesting question. So, again, frequently our standards and guidelines, while our primary audience is the federal agency, they are picked up by other layers of government, state and local, tribal, territorial, industry, foreign governments, and industry around the world largely. I think part of our process, and yes, we do have a lot of guidelines, but it's a very complex space. You have there's a lot of moving pieces in the information security or the cybersecurity space, whatever term you'd like to use. And the space continues to evolve, and I think there's always going to be a need for guidelines to help organizations kind of get a handle on what is this particular, technology space or challenge area. But that's also the beauty of kind of the process that we have in place at NIST, is really to engage the community as we develop these. So what are those standards or those guidelines or practices that we that there's a general interest from the community at having to have these in place? And then working together in a collaborative manner with NIST, with other federal stakeholders and other industry partners as well, to put those in place to solicit kind of the public comments and then really have the best end product that's going to provide value to the community.
We're going to pick back up on this in the next segment, because I think that 7 deadly sins is really a good concept here. Our guests today are Kevin Stein, manager of the Security Outreach and Integration Group in the Computer Security Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Michael J. Levin, the director of Security Design and Innovation at the Office of Information Security for the Department of Health and Human Services, Dave McClure, Chief Strategist at the Veris Group and former Associate Administrator at the General Services Administration's Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies, and Petter Junk, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of BAE Systems. I'm your moderator, Karen Evans, on Federal News Radio's National Cybersecurity Awareness Month special panel discussion sponsored by BAE Systems on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.